Have you ever awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning, stared blankly at the cold ceiling, and realized your inner being is so utterly depleted that heaven itself feels completely silent to your cries? We are living in a fast-paced era where profound desolation is expertly disguised by a relentless stream of notifications on a glowing smartphone screen. It is a modern landscape where you can experience a rapid succession of devastating losses and lose your sense of direction. You find yourself sinking into a deep psychological swamp, forced to carry every heavy burden using nothing but sheer individual willpower until your emotional reserves burn out entirely. But what if the ultimate antidote to your current exhaustion was discovered 2,000 years ago by a man who was stripped of every basic human right? Imagine sitting in a cramped, dark, and damp rented house in ancient Rome around the year 62, with a heavy iron chain binding your wrist directly to a ruthless imperial soldier who watches your every breath. This was the exact reality for a man named Paul, a former religious extremist who once hunted down and terrorized the very community he now considers his global spiritual family. From that deep state of physical confinement, instead of writing a bitter letter of complaint or begging for a quick release, he picks up a primitive pen to compose an expansive architectural blueprint, cosmic freedom, that scholars consider the greatest document on human identity ever produced. The letter to the Ephesians is not a rigid list of religious rules designed to put out a personal fire, but rather a sophisticated and profound spiritual blueprint sent from the shadows of a prison cell to unlock the psychological cages we lock ourselves in today. To truly grasp how this circular letter can heal a broken mind, you must first understand the intense external forces that were threatening the community to whom it was sent. But what kind of structural pressures could cause an entire metropolitan population to experience a collective identity crisis? And how did Paul intend to dismantle that system from his distant prison cell? To understand the immense anxiety of the original readers, we must travel to the ancient metropolis of Ephesus, a bustling capital of the Roman province of Asia, situated on the western coast of modern Turkey. This was a massive urban center of commerce, politics, and occult practices, where over 250,000 people lived under a dome of constant social and spiritual pressure. The entire economy and identity of the city orbited around a single monolithic entity, the magnificent Temple of Artemis, which stood as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Picture an architectural colossus holding over 100 massive marble columns rising 56 feet into the air, creating a sacred fortress larger than a modern football field. For over a century, the citizens poured immense wealth into this structure, and the local silversmiths built a lucrative industry creating miniature shrines for millions of pilgrims traveling across the Mediterranean. When Paul arrived in this spiritual epicenter around the year 52 and spent over 2 years teaching a radical alternative reality, he was not offering an abstract theological suggestion. He was actively shaking the foundational identity of an entire civilization by proclaiming that there is only one true Creator, one sovereign Lord over all things visible and invisible. According to Acts chapter 19, an influential silversmith named Demetrius quickly realized that Paul's message was a direct threat to both his industry's profits and the honor of their great goddess. He incited a volatile mob that rushed into the massive hillside theater, a stadium seating 25,000 people, where they chanted a single slogan for 2 agonizing hours. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians" was the rhythmic roar that echoed through the hills, a terrifying wave of social pressure designed to crush any dissenting voice. Yet, a remarkable shift occurred when many Ephesians chose to step out of that collective matrix, gathered their highly valuable scrolls of magical arts, and burned them in a public bonfire. The total monetary value of those incinerated occult items was 50,000 pieces of silver, an absolute fortune representing an irreversible choice to walk away from their primary source of security. Years later, as these new believers faced the severe social isolation, economic boycotts, and family rejection that followed their decision, they received a letter from their spiritual father, who was now in chains. Under the laws of behavioral psychology, when an individual is cut off from their original tribe, their internal defense mechanisms default to fear, self-doubt, and acute vulnerability. They were standing on the edge of a collective nervous breakdown, watching their mentor facing execution and wondering if their radical departure from the world was a tragic mistake. But instead of sending them a superficial checklist for survival, Paul begins his communication with a sudden burst of linguistic energy that would completely redefine their understanding of suffering. Immediately after a brief greeting, Paul unleashes one of the longest continuous sentences in the entire history of the Greek language, spanning 12 consecutive verses without a single grammatical period. In clinical psychology, this specific phenomenon is recognized as an emotional floodgate opening, where a mind that has been compressed by prolonged external restriction suddenly finds a channel of infinite expression. Paul's internal dialogue completely bypasses the standard defense mechanism of self-preservation, choosing to ignore the physical reality of the iron shackle cutting into his wrist. Instead of validating his own confinement, his cognitive focus expands into a majestic three-wave hymn, beautifully reshaping the mindset of his anxious readers. The first movement focuses on the Father who selected us in connection with his Son before the very foundation of the world was laid. The second movement shifts to the Son through whose voluntary sacrifice comprehensive redemption and the absolute cancellation of guilt are delivered. The third movement culminates with the Holy Spirit who seals and guarantees our eternal inheritance like an unbreakable cryptographic key. By orchestrating this grand heavenly choreography, Paul provides a powerful source of comfort for his audience. He is teaching them that when an individual faces an overwhelming crisis, the only way to avoid being swallowed by despair is to lift their eyes to a grander narrative. This breathtaking introduction forces the isolated believers to realize that their existence is not a historical accident, but a small part of a vast rescue operation that began before time existed. This powerful realization of being deeply wanted by the Creator of the universe prepares the human mind to confront the darkest diagnosis of its past condition. Paul begins this section by delivering a shocking assessment of the human condition, stating bluntly that we were all completely dead in our trespasses and sins. He uses the specific Greek term paraptoma for trespasses, which literally describes a false step, a sudden loss of footing, or a tragic slip off the proper path. For the word sin, he employs the classical term hamartia, an ancient archery phrase that signifies missing the target completely, falling desperately short of the intended destination. Under this diagnosis, humanity was not merely spiritually sick or struggling in need of moral improvement, but rather in a state of absolute spiritual paralysis and emotional numbness. When an individual is trapped in deep emotional trauma or anxiety, they often employ the defense mechanism of projection, blaming their environment or genetics for their toxic behaviors. Paul shatters that avoidance tactic, stripping away all superficial excuses until the reader is forced to look directly into the silent grave of their own spiritual inability. But just as the weight of this terminal diagnosis threatens to crush the soul, Paul introduces two of the most powerful words in human history, but God. These words mark a definitive psychological turning point, shifting the entire narrative from human helplessness to divine initiative. He explains that the sovereign Creator, being infinitely rich in mercy, did not simply give us a moral handbook to help us climb out of the grave by our own strength. Instead, he performed an act of supreme revitalization described by the Greek word sousopoio, meaning to make us alive together with the risen Christ. Paul then drops the monumental thesis that has echoed across 20 centuries, declaring that by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is entirely a gift of God, not a result of individual works. He reveals that the root of grace, charis, is deeply connected to chara, the Greek word for pure joy, meaning that divine favor is not a reluctant obligation but an act of joyful generosity. You are not a random accident trying to manufacture significance from scratch, because verse 10 declares that we are his poema, his beautifully crafted poem, a masterfully designed work of art. Your good deeds are not the expensive price of admission into His presence, but rather the very purpose for which the masterpiece was engineered. This deep healing of the individual soul sets the stage for the healing of the deep relational fractures that tear human society apart. To heal the ancient animosity between the Jewish people and the Gentile world, Paul references a highly sensitive physical landmark that everyone in the ancient world understood. He is thinking deeply about the Jerusalem temple, which was divided into a series of increasingly restricted courtyards based on ethnic identity. Between the outer court of the Gentiles and the sacred inner sanctuaries stood a physical stone barrier, a low wall with prominent inscriptions chiseled into its surface. Archaeologists have discovered fragments of these stones, which read with chilling clarity that any foreigner who passes inside this railing will be personally responsible for their own ensuing death. This was not an abstract metaphor. It was an explicit death threat carved in stone, a physical manifestation of tribal warfare and systemic rejection. Paul knew this wall intimately because the historical records in Acts chapter 21 show he was once nearly lynched by an angry mob that falsely accused him of bringing a Greek man past that very barrier. This traumatic event could have easily caused Paul to adopt a defense mechanism of bitter isolation or aggressive counterattack against his persecutors. Instead, he uses his pen to declare that Christ himself has become our absolute peace by breaking down the dividing wall of hostility in his own flesh on the cross. He explains that the divine purpose was not to force one group to conform to the culture of the other, but to create an entirely new humanity out of the two scattered factions. This represents a supreme reconciliation, where the traumatized outsider is suddenly told that they are no longer refugees or second-class citizens. They are now living stones being fitted together into a majestic new temple, with Jesus Christ himself serving as the foundational cornerstone. By reframing their social exclusion as a divine inclusion, Paul elevates their sense of belonging to a cosmic scale that transcends earthly politics. But this spectacular new human community is designed to do far more than provide social comfort. It is meant to serve as an epic demonstration to an invisible audience. Paul unveils the stunning reality that this hidden plan to unite all fractured elements of humanity under one head was kept secret for generations within the mind of the Creator. But now, according to verse 10, a spectacular phenomenon is taking place through the existence of this diverse community of broken and forgiven people. Paul asserts that the church is actually a universal classroom, and the students watching this space are the rulers and supernatural authorities inhabiting the heavenly places. The spiritual powers of the universe are looking down at this fragile group of believers and learning something profound about the infinitely varied wisdom of God. To describe this multifaceted wisdom, Paul uses the rare Greek word polypoikilos, which signifies something intricately woven with many colors, like pure white light hitting a flawless diamond and scattering into 1,000 vibrant hues. The community is a stunning display case of beauty, where the very messiness of their diverse backgrounds proves the supernatural power of the love that holds them together. This breathtaking realization drives Paul to his knees in one of the most deep and meaningful prayers found in the entire biblical text. He prays that the believers would be supernaturally strengthened in their inner being so that Christ might dwell comfortably in their hearts through an enduring faith. He begs that they would be deeply rooted and grounded in love, possessing the capacity to comprehend the vast dimensions of a love that ultimately surpasses human knowledge. Paul concludes this prayer by asking that they may be filled with all the pleroma of God, an ancient nautical term used to describe a great cargo ship that has been perfectly loaded with every resource necessary to survive a transoceanic voyage. When your inner world is loaded with the full provision of the divine character, your psychological capacity expands to face any terrestrial storm. Once this massive reservoir of internal strength is established, the narrative pivots sharply from what has been given to how we must walk. The opening word of chapter 4 is the monumental conjunction, therefore, which serves as the primary psychological hinge of the entire letter. Paul is executing a critical behavioral shift, moving the listener directly from high theological theory into the raw arena of daily human conduct. The first 3 chapters established your unshakable identity in the heavens, but the final 3 chapters command you to live a life worthy of that calling on the earth. He instructs the community to be intensely eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit through the binding cord of peace. Notice a crucial psychological distinction. Paul does not command them to manufacture or create this harmony from scratch. The structural unity has already been established by the cross. Your sole responsibility is to stop destroying it through your own insecurity and competitive pride. He lists the 7 unshakable pillars of this reality, declaring there is one body, one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God and Father of all. But Paul immediately clarifies that this oneness does not mean a boring, forced uniformity. Forcing every individual to look, think, and act exactly the same is a toxic manipulation that creates deep resentment and suffocates human potential. He explains that Christ has intentionally distributed diverse gifts to the community, appointing some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, and others as shepherds and teachers. These specialized roles are designed to equip every single believer to perform their own unique work of service until the entire body grows into mature manhood. The ultimate destination of this collective growth is the full stature of the pleroma of Christ, where the community is no longer composed of spiritual children tossed back and forth by every wave of deceptive human philosophy. This state of emotional maturity requires us to confront the dangerous emotional impulses that lurk just beneath the surface of our daily actions. Paul moves directly into the field of clinical counseling by addressing the raw, unedited emotions that drive destructive human behavior. He begins with a command that often shocks the religious mind: be angry and do not sin. He uses the Greek verb orgiasthi in the imperative mood, which proves that the capacity for anger is a natural, healthy psychological mechanism designed to protest against injustice, cruelty, and evil. But he immediately pairs this permission with a strict temporal boundary, warning us not to let the sun go down on our parogismos. The term parogismos appears only once in the entire New Testament, a compound word that beautifully paints the picture of someone who pulls their bitter anger close to their side, nursing it like a trusted companion. When you bring your rage to bed with you, wrap your arms around your grievances while you sleep, and carry that toxic narrative into the next morning. A dangerous psychological shift occurs. Paul warns that this nursed bitterness gives the devil a topos, a specific geographical foothold, a legal landing strip within your psychological architecture. Righteous anger is meant to be a temporary fuel for justice, but a chronic grievance is an open invitation for dark spiritual forces to colonize your mind. He commands the community to stop using sapros words, a Greek adjective used to describe rotten fruit or decayed, foul-smelling fish. Your communication should never smell like a decaying corpse, but should instead provide timely grace and support to those who hear your voice. He concludes by establishing a revolutionary formula for interpersonal healing. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other just as God in Christ forgave you. True forgiveness is not about waiting for the perpetrator to deserve it, but about realizing that your own soul has received such an immense ocean of unmerited favor that withholding it from another person becomes psychologically impossible. This standard of emotional freedom must now be applied to our most intimate domestic relationships. Paul invites the believers to become radical imitators of God, walking through life in a constant rhythm of sacrificial love. For the word walk, he uses the expressive term peripatio, which signifies walking around in a complete circle, conducting the mundane details of your ordinary daily existence. This means that love is not an unstable emotional mood that comes and goes, but rather a permanent mode of transportation that carries you from Monday morning to Friday night. Paul applies this peripatio principle directly to the ancient household codes, completely upending the traditional patriarchal structures of the Roman world. In the first century, a Roman patriarch held absolute legal power over his wife and children, a system that frequently defaulted to emotional tyranny and domestic oppression. Paul shatters this dynamic by delivering a command that required the total crucifixion of the masculine ego. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This is not a license for domestic domination. It is an explicit command to die. A husband's authority is redefined not as a tool for control, but as a mandate for absolute, self-emptying protection and emotional nurturing. He quotes the ancient foundational text of Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, reminding them that a man shall leave his parents and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Paul calls this relationship a great mystery, revealing that the intimate union between a man and a woman is a physical echo of a grander reality, the eternal marriage between Christ and his church. By reframing the domestic sphere as a sacred reflection of the cosmos, Paul protects the home from the erosive forces of selfishness and emotional neglect. But as soon as you attempt to establish this beautiful sanctuary of love in your home, you will immediately feel the fierce pushback of an invisible counteroffensive. Paul brings his grand letter to a climax by dropping the reader directly onto a violent, unseen battlefield. He issues a sobering wake-up call, declaring that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against cosmic rulers, against spiritual forces of wickedness operating in the heavenly realms. To survive this invisible onslaught, he commands the church to put on the panoplia of God, an ancient military term that signifies the complete heavy metal kit of an elite warrior. For centuries, people have assumed that Paul simply looked at the Roman soldier chained to his wrist and copied the armor piece by piece. But a deeper look into the text reveals a spectacular literary twist. Paul is actually quoting the ancient Hebrew prophets, specifically Isaiah chapter 59, verse 17. In the Old Testament, it is the sovereign Lord himself who puts on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head to fight for his oppressed people. Paul takes the very armor that the Almighty Creator wore in battle and hands it directly to the fragile, suffering church. You are not fighting with your own fragile, manufactured defense mechanisms. You are literally wearing the invulnerable equipment of God himself. You are given the belt of truth to anchor your core, the breastplate of righteousness to guard your wounded heart, the shoes of the gospel of peace to stabilize your steps, the shield of faith to extinguish the fiery darts of anxiety, and the helmet of salvation to protect your vulnerable mind. The only offensive weapon in this entire kit is the sword of the Spirit, which Paul defines not as a large abstract volume of literature, but as the Rhema of God, the spoken utterance targeted for a specific moment of crisis. You do not survive a severe spiritual panic attack by swinging your own clever arguments. You survive it by speaking the exact words that God has already spoken over your life. But even a soldier clothed in invulnerable armor can be easily destroyed if they are completely isolated from the command center. How can a modern warrior maintain a constant, unbroken connection with the source of their strength when the surrounding darkness threatens to overwhelm their senses? The ultimate practical takeaway from Paul's ancient blueprint is the urgent necessity to terminate the toxic mechanism of individual isolation. You must recognize that you were never engineered to fix your broken life or conquer your deep mental exhaustion using nothing but your own lonely, depleted willpower. The second actionable lesson requires you to practice the strict paragismos principle by making an absolute commitment to stop bringing your open wounds and bitter grievances into your bed. You must actively release the narrative of who wronged you and why before the sun goes down, thereby slamming the door on the psychological foothold that the devil seeks to occupy. The third behavioral transformation is to radically reframe your current painful limitations not as a dead-end prison, but as a strategic address from which you represent the sovereign king. If you are watching this video today with a deeply lacerated soul, with hot tears streaming down your face Because of a relentless avalanche of family losses and economic trials over the past few years, let these words quiet your anxious mind. You are not a forgotten casualty of a chaotic universe. You are an intentional poem written by the very hand of the Creator before the stars were born. Right now, you can choose to step out of the shadows of insignificance. Leave a comment below with the words "I accept," "I receive," and publicly claim your true identity. Your present painful circumstance is not the absolute ceiling of your life, because your God is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that your small human mind can ask or even imagine. You have been chosen from antiquity, you are deeply loved by the Father, and you are fully equipped to stand completely unshakable in the midst of the storm.